A friend who lives in a high rise in the northeast of London. In the last, I was talking to in May, um, remarked that she could breathe London air for the first time because she has severe asthma. Um, and also, as we know, during lockdown, animals invaded unexpectedly towns and cities. There were dolphins in the Bosphorus all the way up at Istanbul. There were mountain lions in Santiago de Chile, and of course the famous Kashmiri goats that invaded Llandudno in Wales. But closer to home for me, each day, um, I would go out and lie in the grass outside as my kind of daily routine and realize that I could hear the birds. They seem to be, and seems to be a very common, almost a cliche experience for many people, but they were louder and more joyful than I'd ever heard them, perhaps simply because there was no traffic in the background. And when I looked up at the sky, it wasn't interlaced with transatlantic planes going across it. But of course, I began each day lying in the grass, listening to birds listening. And so that is one of the dominant experiences for me of the last few months as well, actually, because I've been home with my children, listening to them very intensely because happily I was told that I couldn't work. My TV series was cancelled, my opera in Aix-en-Provence, another show, interviews, everything. And I was absolutely delighted, even though it's been a horrendous time for so many people. There's also been the most extraordinary things. Actually, apparently, the pigeons were the one animal that suffered because nobody was feeding them in the big cities and there was very little rubbish everywhere. But this experience of listening and the fact that listening has been at the heart of the encounter, if you like, it's what it's about, led me to want to talk about that with people who I know, admire, um, have collaborated with in the case of Nitin, would love to collaborate with in the case of Laurie and Brian. What if your what is Laurie? What if is there been anything particular that corresponds to my experience of listening? Has there been something that you have been listening to or have heard for the first time in
Yeah,
lockdown?
I'm in Eastern Long Island, and there are lots of birds, so I know what you mean about that. And bird watching is a perfect social distancing sport. Many things now of uh, stargazing, comet watching. There are lots of things that you can do that involve space in a different way. So I've been thinking about that as how uh, my body is in space, and how that affects how I hear. And first of all, their circumference has changed a lot for me of where I go. And that's very key to how I'm listening and what I means by what do I hear and how do I listen? Because it's always tuned to different frequencies. But right now, my circumference is my bicycle. So I can use cars, but it's almost like when I was 8 and the circumference of my world was suddenly really expanded by having a bike. And uh, now it's the best way to go for around here as well, for many reasons. So I experience the world. Uh, I have a similar sense of freedom uh, by getting the bike, and a different way of listening to. Brian, how did that work with that um, sound in your pocket when you're on the bike? You were talking about that yesterday.
Oh, yes. Laurie's referring to I found this wonderful app called Radio Garden, which I recommend to everybody. I'm just going to show it to you, what it looks like.
Right.
And you see that? It's a map of the world with lots of tiny little green dots on it. And each green dot is a radio station. And you touch the green dot and you are live on that radio station. Well, a green dot that I found that has been absolutely fascinating to me is a 24/7 radio station that only plays Orthodox Russian chants. And
24/7?
24/7.
Beautiful.
I won't play too much, but there are absolutely no announcements. There's no voices at all except the singers. And I've been listening to it for days, weeks now, actually, and I've never heard a human voice. And if you go to the website, there's just a picture of an Orthodox cathedral and no information whatsoever. So it comes from, as you can see perhaps from this, from the very center of Russia. It comes from there.
What's the name of the station?
Cheboksary. But it's, oops, I've gone to another station in Russia there. But what's been interesting to me is that really the only music I've wanted to listen to here has been some kind of faith music. I've either been listening to that, which is all religious music, or I've been listening to another channel called Ancient Faith Music, which is again Orthodox, but Orthodox from other countries, not from Russia, with very strange ancient musical scales, very strange, not like anything I've ever heard before. And then, of course, I listen to gospel music a lot. And I don't know why, but religious music has seemed like the right kind of music to be listening to.
Mm.
I don't know if that's because I feel that we're sort of at the end of the world in a certain way, at the end of a world anyway. I'm convinced that there'll be civil war in America before Christmas, and that we won't be much better off either. So perhaps religious music is my chance to hold on to something.
But also maybe it's because there's something about that sound which comes out of silence. But I was also thinking in where you live in Suffolk and Norfolk on that border. Yeah. That's where you are, isn't it?
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm just in Norfolk. I'm about 400 feet inside of Norfolk. I was born in Suffolk and grew up there. So I grew up about 30 miles away from where I am now.
Wow.
And the landscape, as everyone knows, is very, very flat.
Yeah.
And this music somehow suits that landscape so perfectly. And of course, it comes from a rather similar landscape in terms of topography. You know, if you think of central Russia, where this particular station broadcasts from, it's very similar to here, and just a bit bigger.
It's endless, but perhaps it is something to do with what Laurie was saying about the feeling of space.
Mm-hmm.
That means that there is, which is not just that the music is responding to the topography, but in terms of inner space, mm-hmm. that the music feels appropriate. Nitin, what have you been? How's your listening been? Where are you?
Well, I'm at home at the moment, but I
which is
it's interesting what Brian said when in London. But it's interesting what Brian was saying about Radio Garden, because I discovered that last year from Maris de Vries, who actually introduced me to it, which and I love it so much. And I've been radio programs about classical music and different ways of thinking about classical music. So classical music from India, classical music from Africa, different ways of looking at that. So Radio Garden's been quite invaluable in terms of looking at or listening to music from all around the world. So I also listen to that. And I also listen to chanting a lot as well. Buddhist chanting, Hindu chanting, football chanting sometimes, all kinds of chanting, because I kind of think it's an amazing expression, communal cohesion, and kind of, and somehow I think something evolves really quickly, like like when you hear chanting, it's amazing. It's like watching birds flock. You know, it's amazing when you see this kind of, you hear people literally connecting at a phenomenal speed, in the same way that birds flock at phenomenal speed, you know, faster than they react. And it's almost like sometimes chanting, that kind of act of communing with other people is kind of almost coming from somewhere other than the crowd itself, which is quite strange. Apart from that, I've been listening a lot to music from many different places, but also because I'm making an album, I've been listening a lot to singers I've been working with, and mainly that. But it's also interesting that you were talking about birdsong, because ages ago I worked with Chris Packham, and he made me much more aware of birdsong as a wildlife expert. And he took me to the forest to listen to nightingales, and a specific nightingale that we found. And I had to compose a symphony for the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra based on the nightingale song. It was really interesting because the nightingales have a phenomenally loud mating call. And this one nightingale had been on its own for, it was 2 weeks past its time when it should have left. And so it was trying to call for a mate that wasn't there. So there was an incredible sense of loneliness and sadness about this really loud mating call that came from this one lonely nightingale. So it just reminded me of that when you were talking about it. But yeah, just really mainly listening to music.
Is that zoological appropriation, do you think?
Well, I didn't actually know until a few years ago. There's a whole branch of study called zoomusicology, where they look at how animals actually respond to music, and then learning about chimpanzees and their reaction to consonance and dissonance and all kinds of things. It's really interesting when you get into it. But yeah, maybe it was.
Lying in the grass, I just became aware of how they were all listening to each other constantly, so that any bird call would always, you'd start to tune in, would have a response. It was never on its own. So there's this extraordinary sense of intercommunication.
Well, there's a book by Bernie Krause called, I think it's called The Great Animal Orchestra, where he talks about this idea that in certain rainforests, symphony between all of the creatures there, where they actually fill each frequency. So if one creature drops out of that, out of the band of frequencies, another creature will come in to fill that frequency spectrum, which I find really interesting. So there's a constant hum where every single frequency is taken up by a different creature, which I find amazing. But yeah, it's very.
There's another effect happening as well, which is that because of the noise of cities, the ambient noise of cities, birds are singing louder and higher as well. They're pitching their range up, lots of the birds. So that's interesting, I think, that they're evolving new songs. And of course, then there are the mimic birds, like
lyrebirds.
Well, even blackbirds. You know,
Yes.
blackbirds are very good at mimicking electronic telephones, for example. I had a friend who was constantly running in from the garden because the phone was ringing. And then she realized it was a blackbird. And the blackbird bedeviled her. She had to change her phone ring.
I think it's interesting when you take with the city sound, the diminished city sounds is like there's one thing that exercise that a meditation exercise having to do with waterfalls and this kind of loud white noise, like a whole lot of, I suppose, city sounds of huge generators and air conditioning systems, for and so some Tibetan, mostly nuns, build these little huts at the top of a waterfall, and they listen for 3 years. They're chanting while the waterfall's going on. So, and then they leave and they sing the same song, but without the waterfall. And this is how they are taught the concept of emptiness of the body. I just built a little waterfall and a frog pond that I made, and so I have an animal soloist, and there are crickets around and locusts, but the one frog is doing this mating call, and it's amazing. He didn't come until the waterfall feature was built, and then he heard it and hopped through the woods, and now he's waiting for, I don't know, other frogs, I guess, or a lady frog.
So Laurie, in the going back in time a little, I wanted to, I was just kind of curious. I wanted to ask you, since sort of your time of doing, what was it, when you had your feet in ice, in skates, that was a while ago.
That was a while. Okay, you've been meaning to ask me since 1974.
No, but I was wondering whether, because you have introduced us to, so you're consistently kind of compulsively curious, and always on the lookout for, you know, I notice that whenever we've been together, you're always showing me new things and new sounds. So you're constantly on the edges of a kind of sound world, discovering new things. I wanted to ask you, have you noticed in the time that you've been performing and making things, is there a change in the way that people listen over your?
I'm sure there is. I mean, for me, I sometimes now listen with a sense of danger, because there are so many sirens here in the city and around. So you tune to that frequency, and also to explosions and gunfire. And so I listen with a sense of trepidation sometimes, obviously, and protection, and I realize how many ways I have, that you almost have to know what you're listening for to listen. And so I've tuned a lot of my ears to listen in different circumstances. A friend of mine has something that he calls ear yoga, and this is like a training for how to feel the sound waves going through all the curvy yoga positions that they have to squeeze into as they come into get dumped into the middle of your brain, and then, I don't know, jostle around with similar sounds or memories of similar sounds, or, you know, but I'm much more conscious now of what I listen, how I'm listening, and sometimes like, what am I listening for? Why am I so ready to hear something? And so I tend to hear the things that I'm ready for, of course, like everybody else. So, but I'm just more aware of how I'm doing that now, rather than
Right.
using different techniques for different moments. I'm just more
In this time where we can, you know, we've got Radio Garden, like Brian was pointing out, we have access, you know, instantaneously to almost anything, but also we are, I feel, for me, sometimes I'm kind of, can feel like I'm assaulted by sound. It seems to be much louder, just as I feel that, you know, when I'm working in the theatre or in film and I'm thinking about stories, we're surrounded by more fiction than at any other time in history or prehistory. And there's a sense of kind of noise. And we know that our, you know, we have our ears and our faculty of hearing, but listening is a kind of conscious act. And so it requires exactly, you are listening out for things, and the brain's principal function is actually not necessarily to make things work, but inhibit, to filter out things. So you can have what's called the cocktail effect in a party. You can look across the room and see somebody's lips and phase out all the rest of the talking, and then tune into them. But somebody that you and I have talked about, who is my good friend John Berger, who wrote this wonderful story to the wedding. I remember, because he sometimes kind of appears, his voice appears in some of his fictional works. And in it, in this very beautiful book, in which there is a young girl who becomes HIV positive and then contracts AIDS and then marries a young Italian boy, and they marry in the Po Valley. It's really, really beautiful section, and they get a band, and the band start playing, and two old Italian men sit on the edge of the sort of arena of where the dancing and the music's going on. And it's like a punk band, and they're going kind of full pelt. And one old man says to the other, why do they have to play so loud? And the other man replies to the first man, and I kind of think of it as John, because the other man says they play loud to keep out the din of the world. And I suppose I was wondering, Brian, because in kind of 70s, nobody had thought of music as something, when you first started to make ambient music, as sort of a space, it was just something you could walk into and walk out of. Whether there was any thought of as it were, that's set against an exterior noise, or that had nothing to do with it?
Well, I think ambient music was sort of a reaction to my realization that this new art form had appeared in the 20th century, which unfortunately inherited the name music. It should have had a new name.
Yeah.
Like music, N-U-S-I-C or N-U-Z-I-K or something like that. Because if you think about it, until the 20th century, music was ephemeral, local, it was always linked to a place. It was almost always a shared experience. So a public experience, if you like. And you were never likely to hear anything exactly the same again. So the 20th century comes along, and a transition happens to two art forms, one of them being music, the other one being theatre. Theatre gave birth to film, and we call it something different. We don't call it theatre, we call it cinema.
Yes.
Music gave birth to this new form, this recorded electronic form, and we still call it music. And it's confusing that we do, because actually it is made differently, heard differently, and used differently by listeners. So in every dimension, it's kind of a different art form. Yeah. So by about the 70s, I was very clear that that was the case, and that we could have a new set of rules, a new set of musics. And whenever there's a new kind of music, the real implication is not to do with it uses different scales or different instruments. What it's to do with more than anything else is a different expectation of what a listener is doing. So it's a new music is really a new way of listening. And I think ambient music was sort of saying, look, a lot of us are using music in a way that nobody used music before, as an ambience, as a space filler, as a tint, as an emotional setting of some kind. Why don't we accept that? And why don't I give it a new name? I was just trying to get away from that music idea. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit more
later.
But
also the consequence, of recording, as you say, meant that everybody. I mean, Mozart had no idea that his pieces were going to be listened to 100 years later. He wasn't making his pieces for a future. He was making them for that moment.
Yes.
At the moment you have recording, it's like the same thing as the moment you have moment photography comes along. Painting, in a sense, is liberated, but you also get this phenomenon of being able of repetition. You hear the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Thinking of, there was a new name for music. It was Muzak, and it's like, it's music to shop by, right? So if you Nuzak, I mean, music, it feels too close to news for me, or like something that's new, because it's what you're saying is spatial, not that it's so much new, because we've always had a spatial experience of sound,
Yeah.
but music is, what does that mean, music?
It's such a great word.
It's a great word. Whoever thought of music.
Everybody must have been so happy to have thought of that.
But I think you gotta get a name for what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that.
Sorry. Yeah, what were you saying, Laurie?
It was just reminding me of this book of just to go a couple of steps back, called "I Listen to the Wind That Obliterates My Traces," and it's a book of pictures of people listening to music, and I never had this experience of hearing photographs before. I mean, it's like, and so they're just very intense photographs of from, I guess, 1880 to 1955, and Brian, I was just reminded of one. There's a beautiful passage by Nabokov, too long to read, but if you get this book, you can read it. It's from Podvig, and he describes all of these sheep coming in with their crosses on their back, and the sound that of the bells of the sheep, and then but he doesn't describe them as sheep. He says that there was a cloud of dust came flowing, a gray, curly, tightly packed mass. And then he describes at the end how the sound of this pack of dust, which is sheep, would hang in the air. The sound of the tintinnabulation, I think he says, would hang in the air together with the dust. Mm-hmm. And so it's the sound and the dust that come off the sheep and make this whole place that you're in. And I think whenever painters, for example, try to paint atmosphere, you know, a lot of painters do make objects and they forget that it's, you know, they're painting things maybe in the fog or the sunlight or something, and they forget that it's all about vibration as opposed to things. So anyway, this is if you're interested in, this is a book by Steve Roden, Roden, and it's a really, really beautiful book by a company called Dust to Digital, and they've made a lot of beautiful things.
Yeah.
Also about sound, how things get embedded in other objects, how sound gets embedded in things.
But I was thinking about this. That's beautiful. Yeah, the sound embedded in things, and I was reading the other day about how the resonance of caves, where there's cave art, the resonance is different according to what, or somebody's done a whole study about the resonance being different according to what animals are painted. So they've tried the length of time that a voice can sustain within the echo within the cave. And according to kind of, you know, when there are more ungulates and grass-eating animals, it's longer, and when there are felines, it seems to be shorter. I don't know if that's absolutely true, but there is something interesting in the relationship between the sound or the listening that can happen in a space and what is actually there. But I was also thinking about this question of repetition for us, and I was reading because I got fascinated by Lamont Young, the composer, and I'm just thinking, do you know him, Nitin?
No, I don't.
Because he was very interested in Indian ragas.
Oh, right.
That became very important, and he uses repetition.
And for those of you who love Lamont's music and Marian Zazila, they are trying to survive now. And if you're interested in contributing, they have a big GoFundMe thing because their dream house is about to be repossessed down on Chambers Street in New York.
Oh, right.
And the dream house is not It's not like somebody else saying the word dream house. It's not like I've got my dream house. It is called the dream house.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you can contribute to their dream house.
But you know, the very first piece of music I performed solo was a piece by Lamont Young.
Really?
It's a piece called X for Henry Flint.
Oh, yeah.
Which
Wow.
involves playing the keyboard like this. And you choose what X is before you start. It's a number. So I thought I'll do an hour. I thought I'll do 1 a second. So I chose 3600. Hold on, there's a piano here. Oh, it's not on. So I did that 3600 times, which actually took over 2 hours. I was at art school.
Was that, or was that a live thing?
It was at art college. I did advertise it and people came along, but not many of them lasted the whole performance.
Yeah.
It was riveting for me, but not that interesting for everyone else, I think.
Maybe if you'd done it with your head, you know, because
my brother would have done that.
Nitin, did what does in your experience of performing, do you feel like there's a difference in the way that people listen? Because you are also somebody who's like bringing in sounds and bringing in a whole tradition, which a lot of people are unfamiliar with.
Well, it depends. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think, for example, there are people who have expectation audiences in terms of how they listen to their music. I mean, for example, with Indian classical music, or even with Western classical music, there's an expectation of an audience to actually have a certain degree of understanding. Sometimes, I mean, you know, in certain parts of India, for example, there's the complexity of the tal system, which is very mathematical. And so if you don't understand that system, you're not really going to get all the nuances and all the beauty and kind of, you know, aspects of how Indian classical music works. So it's kind of, it's a strange one because, you know, some of Indian classical music can be like mathematical poetry. It's very much, so I mean, in fact, that's one of the things we did when we did a Disappearing Number. When I worked with you on that, that was something we were talking about with the way in which people were speaking rhythms. And that's kind of, you can almost be conversational with speak rhythm. And that's kind of that's a very interesting thing because it's a totally different way of listening. If I can play you something, I'll share my screen with you and I'll play something that I did in lockdown with Arif Dervish, who's a tabla player. And let me share my screen. Hang on a second, let me just do this. Whoops, hang on a minute.
We're on tenterhooks.
Yeah, hang on a second. Though it's saying starting share screen, stop other computer sound share. Do you want to continue? That sounds quite scary. I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, here we go. Can you still hear me?
Go for it, Nitin.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. So this is actually the current slide. Right, so here we go. You've now got my screen about to come up. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the thing that we did called the conference, which you've heard before, Simon.
Yeah.
Right, so let me just stop the share. I think everything's died. In a second.
Well, we could hear most of it.
Well, I'm trying to stop. I think everything's died on my computer suddenly. But what I was going to say was it's kind of, so could you actually see it moving? Could you see the image moving
At the beginning.
At the beginning,
okay.
and then
Yeah, I think the whole thing crashed. But I was just going to say with that piece of with that, it's interesting because it's actually, in one way, it's conversational and it's kind of quite visceral and very much about how we're interacting, but also it's based on quite complex, well, not complex mathematics, but it's based on rhythmic cycles. And if you know about those cycles, you're going to be able to hear the highs, and you're going to be able to hear some of the patterns that evolve during the course of it. So it's kind of, it's interesting kind of, you know, whether it's required to actually learn about something before you listen to it to get the best out of it, or whether sometimes it's quite good just to let something wash over you. And, you know, that's an interesting.
I think, Nitin, you've now gone out, but Brian,
Hello.
I was interested when we were talking the other day when you said that you could, because in Suffolk you have all of these bell towers.
Mm-hmm.
You gave me that you once wrote about I think to was it Campanology magazine?
Oh yes. Well, I got interested in bell ringing because I love the sound of it, and we had a very good peal of bells in the church in Woodbridge, and so I then discovered that there was and still is actually a magazine called The Ringing World. Isn't that a great name for a magazine?
Yeah.
Monthly. Well, it's now a website, of course, so it's more than monthly, but it's just about bell ringing. And I thought I would love to hear more about bell ringing. So I wrote to the magazine and said, "Dear sir, could you please tell me where I can hear more music, bell ringing music?" And I got a very stiff response saying, "We consider bell ringing not to be music, but mathematics. Yours sincerely." It was like, keep your filthy art student hands off our bell ringing, please.
We just had a huge controversy in our little town here because AT&T had decided to build a huge cell tower, and they were going to disguise it, build it on the back of a church and disguise it as a 14th century San Gimignano bell tower. Mm-hmm. And they showed pictures to everybody in the town, and there's this little church, and there's the steeple, there's other thing, and their bell tower, this was this big, and then the bottom it says not to scale. And when you actually do the numbers, here's the church, and the steeple is out of the picture. It's huge. And so we just, I mean, to me, that was the worst thing that you could imagine, is this big high-tech company coming in and just going to disguise a cell tower as a bell tower. It was just ridiculous. And
it's only a single letter of the alphabet different, you know, it's pretty
exactly.
Bell tower to bell tower.
B to C. And so we made a huge, all the neighbors got together, and we thought we're never going to win against AT&T. And we just won. It was like 2 days ago, front page in our little local paper, bell tower rejected. And on that basis, really, that it's not a great idea to disguise something as something else, you know, that on the basis of like, this is going to look so much more beautiful because it's historical. And someone on the town council said, "Oh, he's back. Let's put a nice cedar salt box, typical Eastern Long Island chunky box in the middle of Venice. That would look so beautiful, so authentic. It look, it just anyway."
So, Nitin, you vanished like
my whole computer crashed.
Brilliant.
I think it's just the shot by Haskell rhythms coming in it. but yeah, sorry about that.
We were just talking. Brian was just telling his story about the writing to a bell ringing. What's it called? Ringing Today.
The Ringing World.
The Ringing World, that's right. The bell ringing magazine, which is called The Ringing World. Apparently it's now a website, and said he'd like to hear more about bell ringing music. And he got a letter back saying, "Dear sir, we do not consider bell ringing music, we consider it mathematics." So that was just following on from what was going on. But it's true, when we were learning T-highs and disappearing number, you did have to begin to think in a whole other way. And I suppose that was part of the theme in the encounter for me, was thinking about how we listen. That's to say, we grow up with a very, very specific narrative. I grew up in Cambridge with a whole set of particular relationships to buildings, but also, of course, with a very British narrative, which I didn't feel necessarily particularly comfortable with. And so one of the things that interested me in the encounter is getting inside the head of someone who is gradually, his consciousness is taken apart bit by bit to the point that he has to, he begins to listen, or really has to listen in a new way. And so I'm just really interested about where we are now. And of course, the way that, and this question about, we've talked a little bit about the past, but also, and Laurie said, well, she is she is where she is now, but I'm interested in this question about the future. Is it possible to talk about, for example, can you listen to the future? Is that possible? I mean, we understand what we mean by listening to the past, and Laurie, you were talking about listening to objects, and, we can listen to spaces. But I'm interested in whether listening can, is this an important way in which we can change our consciousnesses?
Well, I think,
therefore affect the future.
I think that's what we're always doing when we're listening to pop music. We're listening to a future, in a sense. If you think of the things that have been happening recently in pop music, first of all, the most important thing for me is this new sense of detail, where sounds are recorded very, very close. So if you listen to Billie Eilish's voice, for example, you can hear every bit of spit in her mouth and every touch of her lips and so on. So we're listening to her under a microscope. It's like having somebody right in your ear here, which actually, again, is something that is happening a lot now in the form of ASMR, this new way of, I don't know what you call it. I call it a new form of art. Artists don't seem to have noticed it yet, but this is a.
I would take exception to that, because I tried to use it in the encounter.
Well, you did, yes, you have noticed it. It's true, but this is really a new way of listening. I think, of listening to somebody else this close to you. It's kind of alarming, in nature. If that happens to you, you're frightened. In nature, if you hear very high frequencies in a voice, it means somebody's too close to you. Something's too close. But then think of the other things that are going on in music now. The amount of discontinuity and interruption in an average pop song. It's all breakdowns and chops and splices, strange new sounds coming in for a second and disappearing again. It's very, very different from what music used to be, at least what pop music used to be. which was relatively continuous and repetitive. And yet at the same time, it then has motifs which are extremely repetitive, like a little sample that will play all the way through a song. I think these are this sort of hyper-realism of this way of recording that's going on, where we have a very expanded dynamic and a very expanded frequency palette as well. It is telling us something about who we are turning into as people. We're listening to the idiosyncrasies of other voices. We're not listening to, it's the opposite of listening to opera, actually. Operatic voices tend to converge around one particular palette of sound. What we're doing now is exactly the opposite of that. We're listening to voices for their particularly individual character. I think it's a very encouraging sign, actually, because to me it says that we are not, we haven't become creatures of herd yet. We're not H-E-R-D. We're not herd. We're not a herd yet.
Nobody's heard. I don't hear that so much in pop music, maybe because it's so compressed, and I have to listen to it in a way that I don't usually listen to it. But when you mentioned the ringing world, you know, I was just thinking of bells versus you know, phones, because I think people have tried to change their idea of what intimacy is and detail many times. And I just remember what the phone used to sound like before the cell phone service was really bad. You put the phone to your ear and it was really, really crisp, and you could hear all sorts of things that you can no longer hear in phones because of a number of issues. But you know, I know a lot of people from my generation who had their first love affairs on the phone, because you'd be right inside someone's head, whispering to them. And then it was also great because it had to do with being remote, completely remote from that person. So if you said something stupid, you could hang up right away, you know. But it was extremely intimate, detailed sound experience that for me is just as intense as listening to Billie Eilish's, you know. But
Yes.
I think our phone technology and our general technology is so bad now that, and also so are MP3s, and so is a lot of stuff. So it's sort of a good surprise, like you say, to hear more air in it, you know. But it's usually all pumped out. I mean, with my instrument, I go to a lot of trouble to replicate the sound of how a violin sounds next to your ear, which is full of crunch and rosin and trembly, creaky wooden things going. And the violin was made to be listened to at a great distance on a stage, and all the frequencies are tuned to, you know, just like you're saying with opera. It has tuned to those things that jump across distances. And so when you use technology to get detail, it's you suddenly hear all the things that you hear when you play. You hear the overtones, the harmonics, the vibration of how it feels here, you know, as opposed to projecting out so that other people can hear it in a little more pure form. But
yeah, that's in your I mean, you played us a piece which seemed to really just was talking about that, the clouds. You were
the cloud. That was actually, in a way, the opposite, because you don't hear that detail in that piece. It's a lot of synth processing of strings, but I made it because I, like Brian, my impulse is to listen to something that's somehow attached to a sense of hopefulness, because I just wake up every day.
Can we play a little bit of it?
And so I have to find a way to feel somewhat, you know, that life is possible. So for me, it has to do with listening to mantras. The chanting of the Heart Sutras are beautiful. Any kind of drone music, all sorts of things. Krishnadas also has some really great, beautiful pieces of music that are all very loop-like and very, but mostly all voice, all human voices. Just because it's so lonely now.
Can we listen to a little bit of that?
Oh, the cloud? Yeah, that was just a little fragment I made on the violin to listen to, sure. So that's those pitches being sent to various different sized places. And so when you were talking about the cave, you know, has anyone ever done, have you ever done any concerts in caves?
I have, yeah.
You have? What was that like? What was that like?
Well, I was in Gibraltar, and I did a concert there, which was in a beautiful cave in Gibraltar. It was fantastic. It's such a nice sound. And by the way, when I was just listening to that just now, I was thinking of whale song. It just kind of reminded me of that, and which is so amazing. It's because I love whale song. It's because it's a tradition with whales. They actually that move to different parts. Whales actually have almost their own traditions. So you'll hear these songs that are passed across the planet by whales, and they have the greatest frequency spectrum of any creature. They can hear from 20 hertz to 200 kilohertz. So it was amazing hearing that. It just reminded me of that. But yeah, playing in a cave is incredible. It's a very it's in a way it's weird because it feels intimate because of the proximity you are to people, but at the same time because of reverberation, it also feels quite epic. So it's a strange kind of combination of being in a situation that kind of feels huge and quite overwhelming, but at the same time very close up, and you know, so it's a strange contradiction in a way. But I really love it. It's beautiful.
I think there's something about the sound in caves, given that they are the earliest places of that we know of human habitation. You know, that's of course not true because trees and the open air and built shelters would have been, but of course they haven't survived. But my father, who was an archaeologist, dug a site in Libya. He was actually he was in the war in North Africa, and he took time off every now and then. He was in the intelligence service. He took time off. He was analyzing air photographs, which is what most archaeologists did when they were in the intelligence service. And he took time off to look at sites because he was very interested in the prehistory, the early prehistory of North Africa. And he came across this enormous sort of overhang, and he was scuffing around in the dirt, and he picked up a couple of lithics, stone implements. And so he made a mental note of it and then came back after the war and sunk an enormous sound going down to, 15 meters into the soil of this enormous overhang, which was called the Hawafatir. And he discovered that this cave, this enormous cave, had been in continuous occupation for 100,000 years. Continuous human occupation. And at about between 40 and 50,000 years, in the soil, he discovered a bone which had, he looked at it and analyzed it. It's curious, it had little it seemed to have been shaped. There was a hole in it and so on. And after taking it back for analysis and cleaning it up, they realized that it was a flute. And I think it is the world's earliest musical instrument. Of course, there were many more before, but actually found. So the thought of the human breath blowing through a bone, I found very moving, this link with the past. But Nitin, what about do you think that I'm interested in this quality of listening as to whether, in a sense, we, Brian, from what you say, that you can hear all these details, that you feel hopeful about the future, but also there's something about the quality of listening in which something can, I suppose, is that possible to change the way that we think? Because I feel that we need to change the way that we think. I suppose that's behind what the question.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I mean, it's interesting because I'm always textualize music in ways that people perhaps, I mean, I hate anything that feels didactic or like you're trying to send out messages through music. For me, I don't really, I can't get into that. But what I try to do is give context to what I'm feeling. And sometimes I think when you do that, you're kind of allowing people to find their own way into something. So when I do certain albums, I've always kind of, like I'll interview my mum or something and actually have that before a piece of music to show where it comes from, that it came from a kind of feeling about her or thought about her. And I think in a way it changes the way people listen. So when you contextualize music in some way, I find that's a really useful device for getting people to perhaps think in a deeper way about what they're listening to and maybe listen to the lyrics of the music. And all kinds of contextualization, like maybe taking Indian classical music or other forms of music and putting them in a different context that you've never heard before. So decontextualization or recontextualization, I always find, is a really good way to get people to listen to music in a way that they maybe, they feel familiar with something and then they hear it again as if it's the first time. And I think that's quite, I mean, I enjoy doing that, but I don't know whether that's it's just my approach, and it's something I'm doing more and more.
There's no question that learning through you about ragas and learning about tihais and understanding, because the piece that I made was about Ramanujan, that we made was about Ramanujan, and there's no question that he grew up the great mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan, who sort of changed mathematics in a way. He grew up in a circumstance where there wasn't any gap between music and mathematics. It's all part of the same thing, and he claimed that his mathematics came from God. Just as the music did.
I think that's the case with, even with Western, it's interesting you were talking about the flute, because Pythagoras actually dealt with vibrations with strings, and he was able to, that's where the octave comes from, and ratios, so that we actually recognize a perfect fifth or a perfect fourth or a third, or, so actually mathematics is intrinsic in every instrument we play in the West as well. It's those ratios that actually kind of define how we listen to music as well. So I kind of think mathematics has always been a part of everything to do.
I've got a few questions here from people from different places in the world. Can I put them to you? Are you frozen, Brian, or are you just very still?
Just still. Yeah.
This is from and I'm not sure I can pronounce her name, but Katarzyna Roy, spelled Katarzyna, and her surname Roj. And she asks, can proper listening help us to establish a lost relationship with the ecosystem and other species? Brian.
When you make a piece of music, what you're really saying to somebody, to a listener, is pay attention to some things, certain things. Now, when I was saying earlier what was different about contemporary pop music, those differences are really being called to our attention. So pay attention to the idiosyncratic detail of a human being's voice is kind of a new message in music in some ways. I mean, it's a very old message in some ways, but it's an anti-homogeneity message. It's a message saying every person has different spit and different ways of making their lips click and so on. And another thing that I think you're being asked to pay attention to now is discontinuity and confusion. Now, somebody like me, when I watch young people, groups of young people talking and carrying 3 or 4 other conversations on their phones at the same time, I find that actually quite disorientating, and I don't know how you do it. But I do know that the kind of music that they're listening to does the same thing. The music has that kind of cut up, constantly shifting focus. So I'm trying to answer Katarzyna's question by saying that if we start to think about ecosystems, like I've been thinking about for quite a long time now, that can't help but inflect on the music that we make. For example, I've been working for quite a long while now with what I call generative music, which is a kind of ecosystemic music, if you like, not in how it sounds. It's not that it sounds bucolic or like the countryside or something, but in how it's made. You know, John Cage said that famous thing, music, what did he say? Music should mirror nature in the way that it is made, I believe he said. So he was not talking about
it should grow like a
yes. So that was his approach to the question of whether art imitates nature or not. He said actually, yes, he said art should imitate nature in its manner of operation. That was the exact quote. And I find that an interesting idea. And of course, to a listener, what you're saying to a listener is listen to this manner of operation. Listen to this way of bringing something into the world, rather than, for example, the classical way of having a conductor and a composer and all these different echelons of players down the, pyramidal kind of hierarchy. So it's saying, if you want to make a political point of it, it's saying this is not a top-down music. This is a bottom-up, growing out of complexity, growing out of simplicity music. And all the music of the so-called minimalists like Terry Riley and Steve Reich and Phil Glass and so on, they all work from that concept that complexity arises out of simplicity.
Beautiful. A question from Tim Redfern, Laurie. Do you remember the first sound you heard that moved you?
No.
No.
I would have a lot of trouble remembering the first sound, the first light, the first face, and the first anything.
Like, is there something that you can remember piercing you from when you were young?
Well, soldiers in World War II were told when they had what's now called PTSD, go back to your families. They were not warehoused in mental hospitals. So one of my uncles got shell shock, and so my earliest memory of sound is him screaming in the attic, and in terror, and he screamed for about 3 years. So I remember that sound, and trying to imagine what had happened to him and what he was screaming about. And funnily enough, that sort of worked. He did eventually stop screaming, and he got a job and got married, and he was always a very fragile person. So I remember that's the first sound that, and I wasn't afraid of it. It was just so, it was very, it just cut into me.
Yeah, that's yeah. That's yeah, very.
He did get better.
Yes.
And it wasn't like, I mean, a lot of, I always think that, a lot of soldiers it takes a long time for them to train them to pick up a gun. And I always thought there should be a reverse boot camp of teaching soldiers who are then pushed back out into the world to find some ways that they could learn to be in the world without shooting. And so, just ways of, okay, put down the gun, talk to this person. I mean, the first sign of civilization. That who is that? That maybe it was Freud, that an argument is the first sign of civilization. When you don't punch somebody, you actually have an argument instead. So, but I was just thinking of how to change time in the last question, which was how to think about ecosystems, because a lot of, I think, kids now, when you say, well, think of like nature, and that's not necessarily a slow growing idea for them of a flower that takes a long time to bloom. It can also be a lot of the culture they're experiencing, which is cut up and violent and sharp edged, and nature is more like a tsunami now. It's more like an earthquake, something very violent and very sudden, and it's not the fields and the corn,
Yeah.
So their cut up world is they're expressing that cut up world. And so I don't know, I think that's it. One way to start to think about how you might be able to think more clearly about the ecosystem, I think, is almost step back until you're dreaming rather than thinking. And I always wanted to have a radio show at 4 a.m., live in San Francisco, have a radio show and play music to people at 4 a.m. When you have no defenses whatsoever, you're just like, all your logic is broken down. You're not analyzing things. You're not at an 8 o'clock concert. You're not dressed up to hear your favorite pop singer at midnight. You're like kind of in the drift. And so in that time when you're not so thinking, what should we do about the ecosystem? But when you're dreaming about the ecosystem, when your borders dissolve, music dissolves your borders between the trees and you, and the world and you. It just melts them. So the defenseless part of you then can come to the surface a little bit more.
Yeah, music offers you the chance to surrender, actually. Yeah. Well, all art does. Yes. As does religion, actually, and sex.
Because it's out. There's something about, but there's something to do with time in it. Because I think it was Pastnak who says music is the noise of time, and all times, in some sense, come together. So past and future and present seem to be combined. But there's a question from Jane Nash for Nitin. How is your listening affected by being in virtual space? I don't know if you can answer that at all.
Well, it's interesting because I've had a few collaborations during this period of lockdown, and actually you can't listen in real time properly to people. So, for example, you can't actually have a jam with someone. You can't play an instrument with someone without there being some latency. So the problem is it's very difficult to actually listen in.
So you have to imagine what you're hearing sometimes.
Yeah, or you actually ways of creating some kind of interaction. So it's kind of so it's looking at that a lot, and then so sometimes people will be sending files over to each other to listen to, or even videos of ourselves playing, and then we'll actually put them together. So sometimes you end up creating in virtual space the illusion of an actual interaction. So it's quite weird, because you know, it's very hard. I love bouncing off other musicians, and some, you know, this whole period has taken that away. So you're not able to literally bounce off another musician. So you have to find another way to do that. And that's been interesting. So I've been learning about video editing, or I've been learning about other ways to explore that, rather than just simply, you know, having to be a slave to the fact that we can't jamming in real time, and that is difficult, you know, because I think it's made me feel much more appreciative of when you are in a space with someone, and how amazing it is. Like today, I was actually in the studio with Anna Phoebe, who's playing violin with me, and I was playing the piano, and it was the first time I'd done that in 4 months, and it was just incredible. Just to play some classical piano and have someone play violin with me was amazing, because it's something I'm used to, not with people, playing with people, but when that's, you know, when that's being taken away from you, and you can't really have that real-time interaction, you really miss it. So,
yeah, that's interesting about when something is taken away, because there's a question here, I've lost it, but I don't know, which is about oh yes, from Michael Thomas in Krakow in Poland. How important is the quality of silence in your respective areas of artistic expression? And I was really interested in this question of silence when making the encounter, because I wanted to, I was constantly asking myself, what is silence? In the sense of, you know, people talk about kind of a void, you know, and it seems there isn't such a thing, you know, everything is full of something. Space, which we thought of as a void, has actually been shown to be full. And so when people talk about, you know, I really want to go somewhere to be silent, of course it never is silent. It's always, as Brian points out, full of ambient sound. So to try and understand, get a feeling for that, we went up to Watford, where they test the safety of buildings, where they have a big anechoic chamber, and I asked to be locked inside it, which is something quite a lot of people have done, but they close there's a huge door, you're on a sprung floor that has no sound on it, and you're in this box, and then they close this, you know, 2-meter concrete door hydraulically, and it all shuts, and you're in the dark. And then you really suddenly can't hear anything, really. And you're also in the dark, you can't see anything. I took away all my phones, any light source of any kind. And, you know, it really was the darkness of rock, not the darkness of the ocean or the darkness of night. It was the darkness of rock. You couldn't see anything. And so at first, after I calmed down, the first thing, of course, you hear is like when you're at night, you hear your breath. So that becomes very clear to you. And then your ears are looking around, clearly searching out for any sound. So you hear all the different bits of your breath, and then suddenly you start to hear your heart.
It's a good
It's very strange. You start to hear your heart, and your ears are constantly searching for information. They're zinging around because they're just kind of going, this is not normal. And after about, I don't know, 15 minutes, not only do you hear your heart, but you begin to hear the movement of fluids in your head. So you go, this sort of strange rushing sound that the heart goes, you hear this. So it's very curious, and that some people get freaked out. I was in there about 45 minutes, but I really loved it. It was extraordinary. and then they opened the door. But that experience of being in the dark was not, and in the total silence was not the most startling. What was most startling was this place is in the middle of the country, and it's very quiet when you go in. And when they opened the door, it was like a tsunami hitting me. So just as your experience of, the sudden release of playing with people, last night for the first time in a long time, we had supper with friends, my wife and children and I. And it was suddenly, it was sort of euphoric because we haven't done that. But here, the door opening into the anechoic chamber, that was terrifying, because I had no idea that there was that amount of noise surrounding me continuously, which my brain was constantly inhibiting to make sure that I could hear what I needed to hear. The birds were deafening. I thought that the motorway, as they opened the door, must be literally outside. It was so loud, but my ears had filtered it out. So I had no idea that it was there before. That was, and that's also a very, it gave me a powerful sense of the speed with which the brain can adjust to something or change. I suppose that's the interesting thing for me about the nature of the way that we listen and the idea of the future. And I'm convinced that Mozart, because I did a production of the Magic Flute and I got really fascinated by it, because it was, after all, one of the very last things that he composed, Mozart. And after that, he composed his Requiem on the death of his father. But the Magic Flute is kind of the opposite of Mozart's Requiem. It's so light, and it's a popular piece. But of course, and it's full of kind of Masonic imagery and so on. But I don't think I think the Masonic kind of root is a kind of red herring, because in fact what Masonry was about then was a kind of talking club, because it was difficult to talk, because it was illegal on the streets of Vienna. You couldn't say what you thought, you'd be arrested. You've just had the French Revolution. Everyone is terrified that the same thing's going to happen there. And you're in the period of the Enlightenment, your post-Newtonian age. You've got a clock in the sky. Everyone's thinking kind of logically. And at the same time, they're realizing that the whole world has got to change. And I think my personal feeling in the Magic Flute, with its name, the Magic Flute, what a flute can do, and the idea that music can enchant and change people's behavior, is, I think, that somewhere Mozart believed fundamentally that in writing something like that, in writing music of ineffable beauty, he could somehow change people's consciousness. That's the feeling that I came away with after making the Magic Flute.
Isn't that what art is always doing? Because if you hear something or see something in a piece of art, doesn't that then become a sort of provocation for you to compare that with what's real in your world, the world you actually live in? And don't you say to yourself, I want more of that world in that picture, in my world, or in that piece of music? Do you know those artists, those Russian artists, Koma and Melamid, who did that research years ago, where they asked hundreds of people what for them was a perfect painting, and then they consolidated all their answers, and they painted the result, and the perfect painting was kind of what you'd expect, a landscape with.
I remember, yeah.
Yes, and the interesting thing about that was that it was really an image of security in a certain sense, because it was a landscape where you had a very big, wide view. You could see everything from a long way off. So it was a kind of a condition of beauty and bucolic loveliness, but also of intense security, of feeling that you weren't about to be ambushed by something. And when I heard about that and saw the picture's not that interesting, but the story is interesting. It made me realize that a lot of what art is doing for us is offering us a more desirable reality. It's saying, look, there could be a world like this. Now, you can't help but compare that with the world that you live in. And in making that comparison, you start to shift your world a little bit in that direction. It's like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, So I think one of the things art does is offers you some alternative worlds. We could live in this world, or we could live in that world. And they're not always good ones. 1984 is an offer of an alternative world that we would want to avoid. But nonetheless, this idea of artists are people who create other worlds, essentially.
Yes.
And we, the listeners or the audience or whatever, are temporarily entering into them and seeing how they feel, seeing what it's like to be in that world, and taking back some lessons from it, I think.
In a sense,
the COVID world is looking more like those most wanted paintings.
Yes.
Because they all have one tree and they have animals coming out of the forest, and they have a couple of shepherds and big, variously blue type skies and some mountains, and but always a person in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Trouble is, we have here, we just have we not only have a lot of deer coming out of the forest, but we also have sharks. Now we can't swim in the Atlantic on these beaches because of the sharks have also shown up. You can go up to your knees. That's it.
they're not worried because there's been nobody in the ocean.
They're hungry.
Yeah. Oh, right. They're hungry.
They're
Yeah.
hungry. Yeah, because there's a lot of the stuff has gotten fished out here, so they're coming in to eat.
Yeah.
Legs.
Well, that reminds us. There's so many more things that I want to talk about. That's really so interesting, what you were saying, Brian, because it leads us on to a discussion in here in the UK. Laurie, there's been this whole discussion about the fact, particularly in my profession in the theatre, because all these spaces are standing empty. And they are, all my friends are, I have a friend who's a most wonderful opera singer, and he's now working with the NHS, Peter Hall. He's a fantastic tenor. They're having to go, freelancers are they're suffering.
He's singing at the NHS or
No,
working?
he's working as a because he trained as well, I think, as a within the medical profession, and he's gone off to work as a nurse. I think he trained as a nurse once, very early on, and he's had to do that. But it's a very curious, because the only dialogue with the government here, which has put out a rescue package in theory for the arts, for which everyone is supposed to be very grateful, but the language that they use makes it sound as if the arts is sort of just yet another product to be consumed. It's just another can of beans, and it's something we've got to get that industry can of beans making art working. It's like, they speak of it a little bit like as if it's like a handbag on somebody's arm. Whereas, of course, what Brian is talking about is that, in fact, it's the arm itself. It is, and one of the functions of art, because in the way that we talk in our life is so full of fiction and so full of a kind of noise that we can't actually see, or we can't hear, or we can't feel. And suddenly, for a moment, the music, a poem, a painting, something, some intervention, a process opens a window, and suddenly you are connecting with the world in
just
what
feeling
might be called
so,
a true way.
yeah. I was feeling so guilty when you were saying that, Brian, because of like that artists create other worlds that are other options. Because I'm just thinking of the things that I've made often don't have that kind of promise of another place that's better than this one, you know? And so much of the world is about promising that, you know, that this is going to be better than what you have. And I'm,
It's not necessarily better. It's just,
okay, another one.
no, for instance, a lot of literature is about the possibility of worlds that we wouldn't want to inhabit.
Yeah.
You know, Dickens, for example, is showing us aspects of the world that we don't like, slums and science. A lot of science fiction is about suggesting, so if things went this way, this is what kind of world we'd end up with, you know. So it's not necessarily about making something better, and also the world that's being offered might not be a figurative world in that sense. The world that you're offering, for example, might be more to do with offering the possibility of being this kind of person, the kind of person that you are, a kind of person who notices certain things that other people don't notice, perhaps. So you know, one of the messages of your work, as far as I'm concerned, is keep your eyes open. You may not even know that that's a message of your work. It doesn't really matter.
That's true.
Well,
I
it
do
is.
a lot of things, especially when you're talking about real time. Do you feel, do any of you feel that you're in real time or whatever that is? You know, because I'm sleeping sideways, and also in terms of music, you know, Brian, when you and I did that thing in Copenhagen, which was play in the studio, and then you suggested, like, after playing in the morning, let's listen to what we just did in the afternoon. I was like, what? That's insane. Sit down and listen in real time to what we did that morning. Let's just listen to the good bits. Where were they? You know, but we listened. And I realized I cannot play and listen at the same time.
No.
I don't know how to do that.
What about you, Nitin?
Yeah.
Well, I like I was saying, I like bouncing off other musicians. So I grew up playing a lot of classical, but a lot of jazz as well. And so from that point of view, you're listening to harmony and you're bouncing off in terms of improvisation. So it is a case of doing both simultaneously, which I really enjoy.
Yeah.
And actually, that's something that I kind of think is also the case with Indian classical. What they call jugalbandi, which is actually musical conversation. So it can be mathematical, and there can be lots of different ways in which you can have musical conversations based on rules and so on. So I think it's very interesting when you have dialogue with other musicians and you're responding in a conversational way. And when we're talking, we're doing both as well. You know, we're listening to what the other person says, and we're also bouncing off that. So I think I'm always doing that in different ways.
So we've come to the end of our time. It's suddenly flown by, and I want to, it's just, I don't want to stop. I just want to keep on talking to you, but we have to. And what you were saying, Nitin, has reminded me that you occupy two worlds simultaneously. You know, every time it's like that's one of the qualities of your incredible qualities of your work. Effortlessly, you're in more than one world, and one of the starting point for talking to everybody was the fact that I made this piece called The Encounter, and in making it, one of the things that I have been doing over very many years is listening to other people's stories. And in preparing for this, I was in the Amazon with different communities, in particular recently in the Xingu. where I was in this, the Xingu is an area, Mato Grosso, in the Amazon, as it were. That's in the eastern, sort of central eastern part of Brazil, underneath the big sort of area of the Amazon. It's just underneath, and if sort of anyway, it's closer to the east. But this is one of the first areas of the Amazon that was sort of dedicated in perpetuity, given back to the people who have lived on it for thousands of years. And in the area of about the size of Belgium, there are 19 communities, of which about 12 have very, very similar language. And I was invited to a funeral ceremony there through a set of circumstances, which was quite extraordinary. I went to this village called Yawalapiti, and the ceremony brings all these communities together. And I had a wonderful meeting with a filmmaker there who was from another village, the Kuyukuru, a man called Takuma Kuyukuru. And if you go to the Complicity site, you can see his films, which tell about where, what exactly what is happening there right now with COVID-19. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do tonight as well is that the village that I visited, not Takuma's, Yawalapiti, has been really hit by COVID-19. And if you like, one of the qualities of the demagogues who currently lead us is their inability to listen, it seems to me, or to be able to listen to any other voices except their own. And certainly Bolsonaro declared that one of the, that he was not going to give any help to indigenous populations in the Amazon. And partly it's well known that he would rather they didn't exist, because then he can exploit the Amazon to its fullest extent. So they've been locking down, but unfortunately COVID has got into Yawalapiti. And Takuma, very, very movingly, when we did one of these first Q&As, talked about how as a village, they live in two consciousnesses, two times, the time of the village and what they call white time. And they have to have their feet in these two consciousnesses, which are utterly different. And the consciousness of the village in there, everything, any story that they tell, any piece of music that they make, anything they paint, begins in nature and ends in nature. It doesn't begin with the self and end with the self. It begins outside of them. What they taught me, I'm eternally grateful for, and it is, my relationship with Takuma, my artistic relationship, is an ongoing and developing one. But in this village, Yawalapiti, which has been hard hit, terribly hard hit, their Kaziki, their headman, Aritana, who I got to know, is now dreadfully, terribly ill in hospital with COVID. His brother has died, as has his son, and they're in a terrible situation. So any of you out there who are listening, you can go to the Complicity website and you can give, because the money will go directly to very, very urgent things that they need. Simple things like oxygen, basic supplies, because they're cut off. I'm not talking about food, I'm talking about things like diesel, because the river has been polluted by soya fields around the whole area of the Xingu, so they need to go further to get fish and so on. Please go to the site, and if you can, and if you have enjoyed this as much as I have enjoyed listening to Brian, Laurie and Nitin, then give what you feel you can. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. I feel very emotional, actually, seeing you here and spending this time with you. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.